Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, November 26th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. confirms that it okayed ATACMS strikes on Russia. So the White House confirmed for the first time on Monday that it authorized Ukraine to launch U.S.-provided Army tactical missile systems, or ATACMS, into Russia. And this is an escalation, of course. Russia has made clear risks, nuclear war, World War III, all that. So National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said that the U.S. did change the guidance for Ukraine to allow ATACMS strikes on Russian territory, including in the Kursk Oblast, where Russia is gradually pushing back a Ukrainian invading force. Kirby said, quote, "They are able to use ATACMS to defend themselves, in an immediate need basis. And right now, that's taking place in and around Kursk, in the Kursk Oblast," end quote. I know the first ATACMS strike that Russia reported was actually in the Bryansk Oblast, so it was not in Kursk. So, again, this is the first time the U.S. is confirming this. We've known this for a while now. It was last Sunday that the New York Times reported that President Biden authorized Ukraine to fire these ATACMS into Russia. They have a range of about 190 miles. And there were unconfirmed reports from Ukrainian military bloggers that say Ukraine struck a Russian airfield in Kursk on Sunday night, this past Sunday night, with a cluster bomb ATACMS. So the cluster bomb ATACMS are an older version of the missile that the U.S. gave to Ukraine first before giving them the longer range one. The cluster bombs, they have a bit of a shorter range, but they're cluster bombs. Cluster bombs are notoriously indiscriminate, known for killing civilians. They spread these small submunitions over a large area. Many of them don't explode, and civilians can find them years or decades later, as we see in Southeast Asia, where the U.S. dropped millions of them. So it was a big escalation when the U.S. started giving Ukraine cluster bomb artillery shells last year. Then they gave them the cluster bomb ATACMS. They've given them some other missiles that can be fired from Ukraine's airplanes that have cluster bombs. So, the Ukraine is firing U.S. cluster bombs into Russia as well. It's just another form of escalation here. And these strikes are not possible without U.S. intelligence or U.S. confirmation of the targeting area. So, I know we've been talking about this a lot, but it's just important to stress what a big escalation this is, because what did Putin say the other day? After the first ATACMS strike, after the first strike with the British Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia, he said that he believes Russia has the right to target the military facilities of countries that are supplying these weapons. And, it was essentially a warning to stop the strikes. It was after the first ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. And now we're seeing reports that more ATACMS have been fired into Russia. And then the U.S. is saying publicly, we gave them the authorization to do it. So, again, it just really shows what dangerous waters we are in right now. I don't know if I could stress that enough. All right, so the next one here, a report says that France and the UK discussed the idea of sending troops to Ukraine. So the French newspaper Le Monde has reported that European countries have resumed talks on the idea of sending troops or private contractors to Ukraine. The report said the talks restarted on November 11th during a meeting between French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Earlier this year, Macron was really pushing this idea of a Western troop deployment to Ukraine, but he received little support. And basically what this report said is that they've restarted talking about this idea of sending troops to Ukraine. So we do know leaks have revealed that there are a small number of NATO special operations forces in Ukraine, which includes British soldiers who are helping fire the Storm Shadow missiles. Again, it shows how directly NATO is supporting these long-range strikes in Russia. But what Macron was calling for earlier in the year, and what they're apparently discussing again, was a large deployment of troops that would be a public deployment. He was talking about sending troops to help train Ukrainian soldiers, but he also, when asked, should NATO send troops to fight Russia, he said, "Oh, I'm not going to rule that out." So he was really talking about this a lot. And then back in June, Macron hosted Zelensky, and he said that he was finalizing a plan to send French troops to Ukraine to train Ukrainian soldiers. And there was all these reports that they were going to send like 2,000 troops. And then it kind of went away. And I think the reason why it went away was, again, it didn't have much support among other NATO members. And Russia was saying, okay, if you send French troops into Ukraine, they're going to be legitimate targets. So it seems like Macron backed down. But this report's saying that they're talking about it again. And this is part of the pattern that we're seeing here. One reason why they said they restarted the talks was in wake of Trump winning the election, and they're worried that he's going to wind down U.S. support for the proxy war. So they're trying to escalate it as much as they can. So in response, the Kremlin dismissed the report and said that it did not correspond with reality because there is little support in European capitals for sending troops to Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "There is no unanimity of opinion among Europeans on this matter, but of course some hotheads appear," end quote. And, he's referring to Macron there, I'm sure, because if you remember, he wouldn't shut up about this idea for like the first half of the year. He was just, doubling down, tripling down whenever he was asked about the idea of sending troops to Ukraine. So another concerning report here. And then the next one here, a top NATO official tells European businesses to get ready for war. So the head of NATO's military committee has called on European businesses to prepare for a wartime scenario amid soaring tensions between the Western military alliance and Russia. So this is Dutch Admiral Rob Bauer. He said that Western businesses must adjust to become less vulnerable to both Russia and China. He said, quote, "If we can make sure that all crucial services and goods can be delivered no matter what, then that is a key part of our deterrence," end quote. He also said that energy supplies could be targeted or used as weapons of war. He said, quote, "We're seeing that with the growing number of sabotage acts, and Europe has seen that with energy supply. We thought we had a deal with Gazprom, but we actually had a deal with Putin. And the same goes for Chinese-owned infrastructure and goods. We actually have a deal with Chinese President Xi Jinping," end quote. So you hear him talking about weaponizing energy. This was something back in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. The U.S. and all these European countries started sanctioning Russia. And Biden's out there saying that they're trying to destroy the Russian economy, turn the ruble into rubble. And then Russia started cutting off some gas deliveries. And then they turn around and say that's Russia weaponizing energy when it was a response to the sanctions, which were a response, to the invasion. But it's just, it was really kind of, I remember just seeing that happen in real time. All these sanctions, all this tough talk about destroying Russia's economy. And then Russia starts limiting gas sales to Europe, and they all got mad about it. So Bauer also said Western economies were too dependent on China. He said, quote, "Businesses need to be prepared for a wartime scenario and adjust their production and distribution lines accordingly. Because while it may be the military who wins battles, it's the economies that win wars," end quote. So more talk of war from NATO officials. This isn't really anything new for Bauer. Last year, he called for NATO countries to consider shifting to a war economy where civilian factories would begin producing military goods, similar to what the U.S. did during World War II. And at the time, he said that NATO was ready for a direct confrontation with Russia. Today, of course, that direct confrontation is much more likely in the wake of all these escalations. All right, so the next one here, Gleeful Graham, Ukraine war is all about money. So this article is from Responsible Statecraft by Stavrula Pabst. So Lindsey Graham, I actually saw this clip going around. I thought it was old. I thought he said something like this before, but I guess not. Lindsey Graham said outright on a recent appearance on Fox News, it was last week, that the war in Ukraine is about money. Namely, Graham told Fox News host Sean Hannity that the U.S. stands to financially gain from Ukraine's vast agricultural sector and $2 to $7 trillion worth of rare earth minerals alike in a prospective wartime deal with the war-torn, albeit resource-wealthy nation. He said, quote, "This war is about money. People don't talk much about it. But you know, the richest country in all of Europe for rare earth minerals is Ukraine. $2 to $7 trillion worth of minerals that are rare earth minerals, very relevant to the 21st century. Ukraine's ready to do a deal with us, not the Russians. So it's in our interest to make sure that Russia doesn't take over the place. Ukraine is the breadbasket of the developing world. 50% of all the food going to Africa comes from Ukraine," end quote. He also emphasized that the incoming Trump administration is uniquely positioned to cash out on such resources. He said, quote, "Donald Trump is going to do a good deal to get our money back, to enrich ourselves with rare earth minerals. A good deal for Ukraine and us, and he's going to bring peace," end quote. So just kind of amazing. So this is what I was thinking of. Back in September, he did mention the minerals, the rare earth minerals. He said the Ukrainians were sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals that could be good to the U.S. economy. So that was in September when he said that. So, just saying it's all about money, this war. Another thing Graham likes to say, and other American politicians, is that this war is good because we're killing Russians and Americans aren't dying. So, these are their justifications to keep this proxy war going, keep this slaughter going in eastern Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, Israel kills 24 Palestinians in Gaza in 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Monday that Israeli forces killed 24 Palestinians and wounded 71 in the previous 24-hour period as Israeli strikes continued across the Strip. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, at least 5 Palestinians were killed by an Israeli airstrike in Jabalia, northern Gaza. 2 more Palestinians were killed by strikes near the Indonesia hospital in Beit Lahia, and both of these cities have been under this total Israeli siege since early October as part of this ethnic cleansing campaign that is ongoing in northern Gaza. You see a picture here of a wounded child. This is from central Gaza after strikes on the Barej refugee camp. Wafa also reported an Israeli strike on a house in the southern city of Rafah that killed at least 4 Palestinians. And then in central Gaza, Israeli shelling near the Nusayrat refugee camp injured 5 Palestinians. Another big problem for the Palestinian civilians, for the displaced Palestinian civilians, they're being devastated by storms, by rainfall. Their tents have washed away. There's high tides, high water. And a lot of them are camping out right near the beach in these tents. And Gaza's media office said that 10,000 tents were either washed away or damaged by floods on Monday. There's also big sewage floods because the infrastructure is completely shattered. Temperatures are dropping. Winter is approaching. People are getting much more sick. And this is just a horrific situation. I mean, imagine living in these conditions, living in a tent for a year with your kids, with your family, have to worry about the threat of bombs, and now the rain could kill you too. I mean, it's just that we have another story about this, but it's just, you see these pictures of these families, and their tents are worn down. I mean, they're not meant to live in you're not meant to use a tent for a year or however long the families have been displaced, but just a total nightmare. And again, winter is coming. All right, so the next one here, minister calls for voluntary emigration of Palestinians under Trump. This article is from the Libertarian Institute by Kyle Anzalone. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich declared his intention to exploit the Donald Trump presidency to conduct an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. He believes he can cut the population of Gaza in half in 2 years' time. He said, quote, "It is possible to create a situation where Gaza's population in 2 years will be less than half its current size. Encouraging voluntary immigration is an opportunity that arises with the new administration," end quote. So, obviously, he calls it voluntary immigration, but if you look at what's happening in Gaza, it's not voluntary. So the finance minister, Smotrich, he's also a minister in the defense ministry that essentially makes him the occupation governor of the West Bank. And he's a settler himself, long been outspoken about, expelling Palestinians from the West Bank and annexing it and all of that. He made this comment while speaking at the Yesha Council, the umbrella organization for settlement authorities in the West Bank. He said, quote, "It is possible and necessary to take civilian responsibility for Gaza. The IDF will need to be there to maintain security, prevent Gaza from rearming and becoming a threat to Israeli citizens again, and in the process oversee civilian affairs," end quote. So, also, as I covered yesterday, some settlers, Daniela Weiss, this very radical settler leader, was helped to get into Gaza by some Israeli soldiers that she knew to scout out locations for settlements. They're ready to go. They're basically ready to move into Gaza, and I think this could happen soon. And I know Smotrich has also said he sees the Trump administration as an opportunity to annex the West Bank, and judging by who Trump made the ambassador to Israel, I think these guys are right to be optimistic that they can carry out their agendas of ethnic cleansing and annexation. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes. Oh, I skipped one. Gaza flooding compounds hardship of people displaced by attacks. So this is an article from Al Jazeera about the flooding. Heavy rains have flooded tent encampments of displaced Palestinians across the Gaza Strip, adding misery to communities already devastated by 13 months of war as Israeli forces stepped up attacks in the enclave. Downpours overnight inundated tents and in some places washed away the plastic and cloth shelters used by displaced people in the enclave, most of whom have been uprooted several times during the war between Israel and Hamas. Some placed water buckets on the ground to protect mats from leaks and dug trenches to drain water away from their tents. Ahmad, a displaced resident of Jabalia, northern Gaza, told Al Jazeera from a tent camp in Gaza City, quote, "We left the north and survived the bombings. We left after the siege, but now the rain and cold are killing us. I've been sick for 3 days. We were affected by the rain. Our children were soaked. Our clothes got wet, and we have nothing to protect ourselves, just the tent," end quote. So again, some of the details I mentioned, but it just seems just like for these displaced civilians, just such a nightmare. And the tent camps get bombed too. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes kill at least 31 across Lebanon. This article's from Jason Ditz. So there is some cautious optimism that Israel's cabinet may accept a ceasefire on Tuesday. But on Monday, the Israeli military continued to intensify attacks across Lebanese territory, showing no sign that the war might really be over soon. At least 31 people have been reportedly killed in various attacks. 62 people were also wounded, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry. The largest number of attacks were reported around the southern suburbs of Beirut, and a substantial number of small towns and villages in southern Lebanon were also hit. Attacks in southern Beirut reportedly targeted buildings across residential areas in several suburbs. So the strikes continued. Not too many details other than the death toll and the location of the strikes, but dozens are still being killed every day in Lebanon. The next one here, Israeli cabinet to vote on Lebanon ceasefire on Tuesday. Another one from Jason. So Israel's cabinet will meet on Tuesday to vote on a proposed 2-month ceasefire, which has been brokered by the U.S. A ceasefire was accepted by Hezbollah and the Lebanese government last week, but it's unclear if it is precisely the one that Israel is voting on. They made some recommendations, so it's not really clear what the actual deal is Israel is voting on. According to the reports, this deal gives Israel some kind of guarantee. Essentially what it is Hezbollah, Israel withdraws from southern Lebanon. Hezbollah withdraws from southern Lebanon. They go north of the Litani River, and then the Lebanese army is supposed to go deploy to that area. There's a 60-day ceasefire when this is going to happen. But these reports are saying that the U.S. is giving Israel some kind of guarantee that if it determines the ceasefire has been violated, that they could go back in there and that they would have freedom to act, which I just can't imagine that that's acceptable for Lebanon or for Hezbollah, but we'll see what happens over the next few days. So, of course, Ben-Gvir and his types are opposing this. Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, says that the ceasefire is a grave mistake and that Israel would be missing a historic opportunity to continue the war and eliminate Hezbollah. So that pressure from Ben-Gvir and that part of the government could be meaningful because Netanyahu, listened to them when it came to the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza. So we'll see. We'll see what happens on Tuesday with this. It's hard to really have any hope the way things have gone over the past year, but let's hope that some sort of truce happens and the violence is curtailed. All right, so the next one here, Human Rights Watch says Israel deliberately killed 3 journalists in Lebanon with U.S. weapons. So Human Rights Watch said in a report on Monday that an Israeli airstrike in Lebanon that killed 3 journalists and injured 4 others was most likely a deliberate attack on civilians and a war crime that was carried out using a U.S.-provided weapon. The strike was conducted on October 25th, 2024, and targeted the Hasbaya Village Club Resort in Hasbaya, southern Lebanon, where more than a dozen journalists had been staying. The strike hit the building around 3 a.m. when most of them were sleeping. Human Rights Watch said that it found no evidence of military activity in the area and reviewed information that indicated the Israeli military knew or should have known that journalists were staying in the building. One thing you see here, a car that was destroyed in the strike has a big, has press written on the hood. So the strike killed 2 journalists and cameramen for Al Mayadeen, and also they killed a cameraman for the Hezbollah-owned Al Manar TV. So Al Mayadeen, Al Manar, these are 2 media outlets that would, put out content that Israel wouldn't like, that would be very critical of Israel. So, there's, I'm sure that they could be targeting the journalists from that specific organization, although there was other journalists staying at this building. Human Rights Watch said that it determined the attack was carried out using a bomb fitted with a U.S.-provided Joint Direct Attack Munition Guidance Kit manufactured by the American company Woodard, and the JDAM kits are developed and sold by Boeing. So Human Rights Watch called on the U.S. to end weapons transfers to Israel. Richard Weir, a senior HRW researcher, said, quote, Israel's use of U.S. arms to unlawfully attack and kill journalists away from any military target is a terrible mark on the United States as well as Israel. The Israeli military's previous deadly attacks on journalists without any consequences give little hope for accountability in this or future violations against the media, end quote. So Israel has slaughtered an unprecedented number of journalists since October 2023. According to the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, Israel has killed 174 journalists in Gaza in that time. The U.S. continues to give them weapons to do so. All right, so the last story here. The U.S. starts talks to ramp up deployments to Fiji. So another thing that Lloyd Austin was up to this past week on his little tour of the Asia Pacific, he went over to Fiji, and he said that the U.S. and Fiji have begun talks on a military pact meant to ramp up U.S. troop deployments to the Pacific island nation as part of the U.S.'s buildup in the region that's aimed at China. He announced the plans to negotiate a status of forces agreement while he was in the country on Saturday. He said, quote, "This agreement will enable us to deploy and redeploy forces in support of Fiji and to help us train with the Fijians on a very routine basis. I look forward to routine rotations, training rotations where possible to be conducted," end quote. So Austin insisted that the idea of establishing permanent U.S. bases was not being discussed, but there are many countries where the U.S. technically doesn't have a permanent presence, but it has a constant military presence, like most of the Eastern European countries that were not parts of NATO after the Cold War. That except Poland, they just established the first permanent base in Poland, but they've been in Poland for a long time now. So during his visit to Fiji, Austin also signed a logistics deal that the Pentagon said was meant to increase emergency cooperation between the two nations. And he also announced that the U.S. would be providing about $5 million in military aid to Fiji, which would go toward the purchase of small arms. And his trip marked the first time a U.S. Secretary of Defense visited Fiji. So you see the map here to get an idea, if you're not familiar exactly where Fiji is. It's pretty far from Australia, very far from China, but the U.S. is expanding its military presence in all of these, not all of them, but in a lot of these Pacific Island nations as part of this plan to prepare for a future war with China in the region. And they're openly discussing this. It's very clear from what you see U.S. military officials say that is the purpose of all this expansion. One quote I always like to go to was General Kenneth Wilsbach. He was the head of U.S. Pacific Air Forces when he said this last year, but now he's the commander of Air Combat Command. But he said that one purpose of the U.S. expanding its footprint in these Pacific Island nations was to give China more targets to have to hit in a future war. He said, quote, "Obviously, we would like to disperse in as many places as we can to make the targeting problem for the Chinese as difficult as possible," end quote. Another reason why I like to include that quote is, these countries that are signing these deals with the U.S., should keep that in mind, that, if this does turn into war and the U.S. has some bases on your small island nation, they're going to be targets of the Chinese military. And that's why, people in Okinawa are so against the U.S. military presence. And that's one reason why, besides the pollution and the environmental damage. But, they have people who live there. Remember, there's still people alive who were there for the Battle of Okinawa between the U.S. and Japan, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. And they don't want World War III to go down on their home island. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Anatole Levin: UK dutifully follows Biden into Ukraine doom spiral. One from Norman Solomon: Omnicide Joe. One from Haaretz: Netanyahu's ethnic cleansing is on display for all to see. I ran that as a news story when it first came out. It's from their editorial board. One from Judge Napolitano: Biden's lust for war. And our spotlight is from Kit Clarenberg: Britain's Kursk invasion backfires. So please go check all that out. One thing I want to mention, this week is Thanksgiving. So I'm not going to do a show on a Friday show. So I record the show the night before. I'm going to record Wednesday night for Thursday. So there will be an actual show published on Thanksgiving Day. But then I'm going to skip that night. I'm going to do some writing. I'm going to go out and have a Thanksgiving dinner and everything and come home and do some writing probably late at night. But I'm not going to put out a show. I remember last Thanksgiving I did it, but there was barely any news to cover. I mean, it's a much different world now than it was last year. Obviously, there's going to be violence in Gaza. Let's pray that there's a ceasefire in Lebanon by then. But I'm sure there's going to be stuff to cover. But just going to skip the show. I'm going to be tired and full of turkey anyway. But anyway, that's it for me for today. Please support this show. Like, subscribe, comment. Tell your friends about it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Follow us on X and on Instagram. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.